Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Best part. Good afternoon. Welcome to a special City Club of Cleveland forum here at the Global Center for Health Innovation, presented in partnership with the Center for Opportunity Urbanism and the Center for Population Dynamics at Cleveland State University's Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. I'm Judy Feniger, as Dan said, a proud member of the City Club Board of Directors and co-chair of the Program Committee. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy, which I understand is now in its 41st week on the New York Times bestseller list. Our program committee is open to all City Club members. We have more than 800 now. And as you can imagine, we get a variety of points of view at our meetings, which are lively and freewheeling brainstorming sessions about potential speakers, and they can get quite animated. They're often contentious, and we rarely get consensus on speakers, which is good. That's what the City Club's about. So the reason I mention that is because when we started to talk about inviting J.D. Vance, we did get consensus. Everybody wanted to hear him, and many of you are here today. The suggestions began right after last summer's Republican convention in Cleveland. Hillbilly Elegy had just been released, and if you think about the timing and whether you heard about it on Fox News or Fresh Air or everywhere else, everybody was talking about it. His honesty and self-examination spoke to many of us, regardless of where we came from or where we are now. His memoir describes his upbringing and his very colorful family, definitively part of the so-called white working class. The forces he believes are shaping the views of people in struggling small towns throughout Ohio and the Midwest is woven through the book. And the book and his point of view about the potential dynamics of the election proved somewhat prescient. In an interview with the American Conservative in July, and if you think about the timing of that, it was shortly after Donald Trump was nominated, but well before the general election. Vance explained why he thought the candidate was so appealing to poor whites, and I quote, "Trump's candidacy was music to their ears. He criticizes the factories, shipping jobs overseas. His apocalyptic tone matches their lived experiences on the ground. He seems to love to annoy the elites, which is something a lot of people wish they could do, but can't because they lack a platform," end quote. Vance was raised in Middletown, Ohio. He's a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, a graduate of The Ohio State University and Yale Law School, and he clerked in the Ohio State House. He worked for the Silicon Valley venture capitalist firm Mithril. He told me how to pronounce it. Mithril? Got it? Capital Management before relocating to Ohio earlier this year. And we couldn't be happier to welcome him back home as part of Ohio's brain gain, or I'll say Ohio's brain regain. He's been quoted as saying he is here to go all in on Ohio, starting with a listening tour and with interest in issues like vocational training and the opioid crisis. Today, Mr. Vance will deliver an address, as Dan mentioned, and then take questions. So ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland and Cleveland State University, please join me in welcoming home J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy.
So I got a book as a present, and I accidentally brought it up here. So if I forget it, please don't let me leave without it. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the City Club for having me. I haven't spent a ton of time in Cleveland, so it's been really nice to get to know the city a little bit over the past 12 hours. But it's the sort of place that, in a lot of ways, is very close to my heart because it's a city that's seen its fair of struggles. It's a city that was hit pretty hard by a lot of recent economic problems and seems to be really trying and successfully building itself back up again. So credit to all of you for being a part of that, and again, thanks for having me. I'm going to talk for about 20 or so minutes, and then I'll take some questions, and my only request is that before I get to questions, maybe you guys can think about some things you might like to ask me, because if I get to the point where I say, does anyone have any questions, and the answer is no, it'll be very awkward for me to stand up here in silence, staring out at all of you as nobody has any questions. And I'll also make the request that if you do have questions, make sure that they start by praising something about me and that they don't ask anything difficult or complicated to answer, because now that the TV cameras are rolling, I don't want to say anything stupid for posterity's sake. So I think it's useful to give just a bit of background on why I decided to write this book in the first place, because I'll be the first person to say that it doesn't make a ton of sense for a 31-year-old to write a memoir, and that's how old I was when the book was published. I'm 32 now. And what really started to get me thinking about writing a book like this is that I, for the first time when I was a student at Yale Law School, found myself feeling like a cultural outsider. I felt like there were hidden social networks that I didn't quite know how to navigate. I didn't know which professors to ask for the right letters of recommendation. I didn't know how to apply for certain jobs. I didn't even know how to decide which jobs were good or bad. And it occurred to me that if I was feeling like this for the first time in my life, that if I felt like such an outsider at a place like Yale Law School, a place that is a gateway to a lot of the opportunities that exist in our society, then something else must be going on, and that must be that a lot of people who grow up in the circumstances that I grow up in maybe aren't doing especially well and aren't making it to places like Yale Law School. And so I started to think to myself, perhaps we have a problem here. And when I say we, I mean the entire country. Perhaps we have a problem if so many children who grow up in the circumstances that I grow up in, if they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, lower income backgrounds in certain geographies of the country, perhaps we have a problem if not a whole lot of them are making it to places that provide later and further opportunities. And of course, if you look at the data, something I found out is that we do have a problem. We do have a problem with children who are born on the bottom who stay there. We have a problem with children who reasonably expect not to make as much money as their parents did. And while I would not argue, and never have, that the American dream is about money, it's at least a useful measure to ask ourselves, are children making more income than their parents? It's an imperfect, but still a useful way to gauge whether the American dream is alive for a lot of people. And of course, if you look at the data, we know that children from all demographics and backgrounds in the 1940s had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents, and children born in the 1980s have about a 50% chance of earning more than their parents. And the numbers are probably even lower for children born in the 90s and 2000s. We don't have the data for them because they're not old enough to have entered the main part of the workforce, but we know we have a problem. And importantly, especially for those of us in this room, we know we have a regionally focused problem. So it is not the case that poor children in Utah are struggling to claim their fair share of the American dream. It's not the case that poor children in San Francisco are having the same struggles. The problem with children being trapped on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, even being trapped in the middle of the socioeconomic ladder, is a regional problem, and it's a regional problem that hits this area especially hard. That's what really bothers me about this, is that it's not like everywhere the American dream is struggling. Not every place in America it's struggling. It's struggling in the places that I care most about. It's struggling in places like southwestern Ohio, like northeastern Ohio. It's struggling for children who grow up in eastern Kentucky and children who grow up in inner city Cleveland. That is the locus of this problem, and we have to admit that it's a problem, and we have to try to understand it. Now, my effort to understand it was this book, and as I looked at the literature, it occurred to me that there was fundamentally something going on in the way that a lot of people talked about the problem. There was a very ideological approach to talking about why is it that so many poor children are trapped on the bottom. Now, if you were a Democrat, you might say that this is fundamentally a structural problem, that there aren't enough economic opportunities for these groups of Americans, that unless we do more, either through public institutions or through economic opportunities, we're never going to solve that problem. And if you were on the right, you might look at the families that grew up like mine did. You might look at children who grow up in circumstances like I did and say those people aren't making especially good choices, that they can't do better unless they start doing more for themselves. And frankly, when I saw that debate unfolding and when I really dived into it myself, it occurred to me that there was some important element of truth to each side of the story. It is definitely true that families like mine make choices that to the outside seem irrational, and it's certainly true that without more economic opportunity and without better public policy, we're not going to be able to solve the problems that I write about in the book. But I also thought that they missed those very ideological diagnoses of the problem, missed something very important. They missed the fact, in a nutshell, that the life of a community is not the state or the individual, that the life of a community is very often everything that exists in the middle of it. It's businesses and unions and civic institutions. It's Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous. It's community groups like churches. And of course, it's families, mom and dad, but also the grandparents, the aunts and the uncles, and so forth. And that if you don't understand what's happening at the level of these mediating institutions, then you're going to fundamentally miss something that's going on in the lives of kids who grow up like I did. And so that's what I tried to write a book to understand. I wanted people to really get the fact that these problems are complicated, that they implicate not just one political movement or one political ideology, but they implicate, and I think should challenge, all sides of the political spectrum. But importantly, if we don't appreciate what's really going on in the lives of these people, then we're never actually going to answer the questions that help us solve the problem that most bothers me, which is that in certain areas of the country, we have a real problem with the American dream. So, very briefly, what are these problems? Well, so one, we think in a lot of cases that community, and especially community as viewed through religious institutions, is doing pretty well in certain areas of the country. We often stereotype, for example, lower income Americans as much more religious and much more likely to participate in religious institutions. And this is important whether you believe in a religion or not, whatever you believe, because we know that there are positive social outcomes to participating meaningfully in a religious institution. We know that children who go to church or synagogue or mosque regularly, they have better social outcomes. That they drink less, that they do less drugs, that they enter stable families, that they're more likely to be productive in the workforce. But what we also know is, unfortunately, among the children who might benefit the most from civic institutions, church among them, but also non-religious ones, participation has really dropped off. So families like mine will tell a pollster, if a pollster calls and says, yes, I'm an evangelical Christian, yes, I'm very devoted to my faith, but if you look at the data suggests that people have largely dropped out of religious participation, and this is a problem that is especially acute among the lower and working class. We also know, of course, that there's a really terrible addiction epidemic that's hitting these communities especially hard. Now, the terrible thing about the opioid crisis is that it has affected every community, of course. I know upper middle class families who know people who have died of a heroin overdose, but it's hitting lower income communities harder than anybody else. And if you look at the rates of addiction and overdose, you know that they're higher among the very groups of people that I write about. Now, what's important about addiction is that it isn't just bad in the moment. It's not just a terrible event. If you're a kid to watch your mom or your dad struggle with an addiction, we also know that it has long-term, multi-generational negative effects. That a child who sees their parents use or abuse drugs is much more likely to do it themselves, and importantly, is much less likely to enter the workforce or to get on the right path in life. I was in southeastern Ohio a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a counselor, a licensed youth counselor, who had a child who was addicted to opioids at the age of 8. And the reason the kid was addicted to opioids at the age of 8 is that his grandparents and his parents were both addicted, that his parents were effectively having the kid be a drug runner, and when the kid successfully delivered drugs from his house to somebody else's house, he was rewarded with a small Percocet. And so he was now addicted to opioids. And again, we know exactly what happens or is likely to happen to children like that. Now, something that was hard for me to write about, but I thought it needed to be written about, is the importance of childhood trauma and family instability in a lot of these communities. Those of you who have read the book know that childhood trauma is much more common among families like mine, that family dissolution and breakup are much more common in families like mine, and importantly, just like addiction, This is not a problem that is just bad in the moment. It's not just an unhappy moment when mom or dad get divorced. It's not just a miserable night when you watch dad come home and beat mom up. We know that it has long-term, multi-generational consequences, that it can even affect the way that young children's brains develop when they grow up in moments of childhood trauma. And indeed, that was the very thing that was hardest for me to write about and to recognize, that when I got to Yale Law School and I thought that I had made it and I was congratulating myself rather arrogantly for having beaten the odds, that I found myself in the relationship with the woman who eventually became my wife, doing some of the things that I promised I would never do to my own family, that I was just as temperamental, that I was just as difficult, that I was just as non-constructive of a relationship partner as I had seen my mom and my various stepdads be to each other. So we've got to accept that. We have to appreciate the fact that when you grow up in a circumstance like that, like I did, it leaves its mark. These demons that we acquire as we're growing up in tough circumstances, they don't just disappear, they tend to follow us around. Now, that's not to say that the economic issues don't matter, because I think the economic issues matter a very great deal. And the conceit that I see in our politics, and frankly I see it from both the left and the right, is the idea that there is a one-to-one relationship between these economic problems. The idea that the only thing going on in these communities is that good jobs are difficult to come by, that the only thing that happened is that the economy went south, and then consequently all of these social indicators started to go south too. I don't think that very strong view is correct. I think, in fact, it's wrong, and we have to appreciate that some of these problems take on a life of their own outside of the economic circumstances. But importantly, the economic circumstances do matter, job opportunities do matter, educational opportunities do matter, and that's what I want to close with talking about just a little bit. Because if you look at the sources of opportunity in our country, if you look at where the net job growth is coming from, it's not coming from Fortune 500 companies, and it's not even coming from traditional small businesses as we understand the term. It's coming from small but high-growth startups. That is where all of the net job growth is coming from in our country. That's why there are so many new net jobs in San Francisco, why there are so many in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in New York City, is because the high-growth sector is so powerful and is such an important part of those economies that there are a lot of new jobs, and people who are able to work in those jobs are doing pretty well. Now, what I like so much and what I admire so much about what Joel and Michael are trying to do with the Heartland Institute is that they recognize that that high-growth, high-jobs economy could exist in the so-called Heartland, but it hasn't existed nearly as much as it could for a few simple reasons. Now, one of them, and you'll hear more about that later, but one of them is the fact that if you think of the tech sector, it's built fundamentally, as one of my mentors said, around the world of bits and not around the world of stuff. If you think about what's been most innovative in the world economy, it's been software companies and social networking. It's been the sorts of things that you can do just with a computer or with a mobile phone. But if you look at industries like transportation and logistics, energy, there hasn't been as much innovation in those sectors, and consequently, there hasn't been as much job growth in those sectors. And so when we think about what's going on with the regional economy in places like Cleveland or Middletown, Ohio, or anywhere where the economy has suffered, it's not that there are unique, new, radically altered levels of disruption, meaning it's not the case that old jobs are being eliminated at a record pace. The problem is that new jobs are not coming online fast enough to replace the ones that are being destroyed. The problem, in other words, is that the high-growth, net growth startup sector has not come to a lot of areas of the country that could really benefit from it. Now, the introduction said that I've recently returned home, and I'll leave with just a couple of remarks about why and some of the things that I'm hoping to accomplish. The first that I'll say is because I have a captive audience. I recently started a nonprofit organization that's focused on the opioid crisis. It's focused on many of the social problems that I think are important and that are affecting our state in a disproportionate level. It's called Our Ohio Renewal, and if you want to go on the website, ourohiorenewal.com, I'd encourage you to do so. sign up for the listserv and follow along with what I'm trying to do and what the organization is trying to do in the state. But the other thing that I'm doing, and this is in my day job as an investor, is working with Steve Case, who was here in Cleveland just last week, to talk about a very important initiative, the Rise of the Rest initiative. And the goal of the Rise of the Rest initiative, and I think the thesis, is that areas like Cleveland have really exciting businesses and entrepreneurs. They have a lot of good things happening, but what they don't have is access to the venture capital that would allow them and enable them to grow. In other words, the very thing that makes the Silicon Valley and Cambridge, Massachusetts startup economy run doesn't exist in quite as large a volume in places like Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati. I think that's an important problem to solve, and that's what Steve Case and I are working on. So I'd encourage you to follow along with that effort too, because ultimately, if we're going to have the new economy provide not just disruption to places like Cleveland, but to really provide a lot of job growth and excitement and opportunity, we've got to have the startup economy exist in places like Cleveland. And importantly, we've got to have it in industries that aren't just attached purely to a computer. We've got to have real innovation in sectors like biotechnology and transportation and logistics. And importantly, I think that's what places like Cleveland are good at, right? I don't think that we should try to recreate and replicate Silicon Valley in the Cincinnatis and Clevelands of the world. Let Silicon Valley do its own thing. It's very good at it. But I do think that what we can have is more innovation, more entrepreneurship, and more exciting job growth in areas of the country that haven't seen it thus far. And importantly, and this is the point that I'll leave you with, you won't just get entrepreneurship and exciting innovation, as cool as those things are. What you'll also get is a lot of good jobs for people who want to work but can't right now. And the thing that frustrates me so much about our political conversation these days is we talk about jobs as if the only thing that matters is the wage that people have. We talk about it as a pure financial metric. Now, of course, wages are important, and good wages are incredibly important, and we can't ignore the fact that they are. But a good job isn't just a paycheck. A good job is about having a community. A good job is about going to work and doing something that's meaningful and dignified. A good job is about being able to go home at the end of the day and say, look at your kid in the eye and say, I built that. I did something meaningful today. And that's what disappears most of all when the economy is able to disrupt and eliminate a lot of jobs, but it's not able to create a lot of jobs. And that's the thought that I want to leave you with, is that we've got to recreate some real economic opportunity and excitement in these areas. Not just for those who are already doing well, not just for the businesses and the owners and the entrepreneurs who have already got a lot of exciting things happening, but we've got to create new jobs in the heartland, in places that could benefit not just from the wages, but from the dignified work that comes along with them. Now, like I said, I don't think that there is purely an economic solution to the problems that I write about in the book, but better economics and better jobs and higher wages would certainly help. And so I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to kick off the Heartland Institute with that in mind, because I think these folks are really working on these issues. They're doing it in the smartest way possible. And we should all wish them the very best, not just because it'll help places like Cleveland, but because I think it'll help the American dream that I'm very worried about in the process too. So thank you folks for having me. Thanks to the City Club of Cleveland for having me. And like I said, only ask easy questions. Thanks.
Excellent job. I'm gonna make stay right here. Don't go anywhere. You don't get away.
I'm going to steal my book, though.
Okay, yeah, steal your book. I gave that to you. Thank you very much, J.D. Vance. Ladies and gentlemen, we are moving into the Q&A. It's great to see you lining up already. We invite everyone to line up behind either of the microphones, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in about 15 or 20 minutes. You're all invited, City Club members and guests, and those of you joining us via our live stream, which is provided by our friends at 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream in partnership with the team here at the Global Center for Health Innovation. If you'd like to tweet a question, we'll try and work it in. Just tweet it at the City Club. So let's have our first question, please. Thank you very much.
Little deeper question, I suspect, than you had hoped. But when I read your book, I was struck by similarities in my own background, although one bigger difference is that we're a generation apart. And one of the differences that struck me is that in the little podunk working class town I grew up in, for myself and all my high school buddies, it was a given that you would not follow Dad into the mine or the factory, that you would be going to college. It was clear that in your environment, there was less emphasis on that. Do you think that's A, because my hometown is not from the hillbilly culture, but from the Ellis Island folks of the early 20th century? Or is it just the difference between being born into the working class in 53 and in 80-something?
Yeah, I wonder, so you're absolutely right that that difference exists. And I don't know that I would pin it on a cultural difference or even on a generational difference. I wonder how much of it goes back to the very entrenched multi-generational problems that existed in my family and in my neighborhood and in my community. And what I mean by that is that, you know, people going back effectively as far as memory would allow and as far as family histories and family lore would reach, effectively knew that their ancestors were not doing especially well economically. That was sort of a thing that I knew, that Mamaw would say, we're poor people and we've been poor for as long as we've been here. And I think that maybe that sort of long-term multi-generational memory changes things, but it's also the case that I really benefited from the fact that Mamaw and Papaw wanted us to go on to college, and that was something that was very realistic, even though it didn't happen to, you know, obviously a lot of people in my family. That was a big deal to them, is that you guys are going to make your living with your minds and not with your hands, and so that was very, very, you know, helpful, and they always encouraged us to go to college. But you are right that it's something that was pretty rare. Even that expectation was rare, and of course the meeting of that expectation was very often even rarer. So I do worry about whether we have a sort of a sense, and when I say we, I mean me and sort of working class communities, those who grew up like I did, whether we have an appreciation for how truly changed the economy is, and how there's often a decision point between, you know, sort of going on to some measure of higher education and not doing especially well altogether. That's just the fact of the modern economy that we live in. Now, the flip side of that, I'll say, is that I think that policymakers and a lot of other folks have failed in this regard, and that's in providing more pathways to sort of decent middle-class jobs, right? Because if you look at the data, there's a lot of good evidence that there are folks who are willing to hire, that there are decent jobs out there that are going unfilled, and a lot of times the problem is that people don't see a pathway between the circumstance that they're in and the skill necessary to actually work in that job. And so when I think about this problem, I do worry that we focus too much on college and not enough on some of the other avenues to higher education and more skill that allow people to earn that dignified, high-wage job. So I think that we can push on it both from the perspective of working class communities and getting folks who grew up like I did to think about what are the options that are out there, but we've also got to give people in that circumstance more options to begin with. Sir?
First, you wanted a compliment, I'll give you one. I didn't read your book, but what you said right now was very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask you, I'm biased, I work for an immigration attorney, but at the same time, I think that immigrant entrepreneurs could be a key to solving the problems you're talking about. What do you think?
Well, I think that's definitely right, and you know, one of the worries I have when I just think about sort of American immigration policy is that a lot of the really high-skilled immigrants are very often all collected by Silicon Valley companies. And I think it's an indictment of our immigration policy that if you want to come to the United States and start a business, it's incredibly hard to do it. And I think that frankly there are failures of our immigration policy that go back 40 years that explain why that is. But I do see, you know, for those folks who are here, they're, you know, very often entrepreneurial in spirit, and if they weren't, they wouldn't have left their country of origin in the first place. And so I do think that's a really interesting and exciting opportunity to take advantage of the talents that they have and to take advantage of the fact that they obviously have a higher risk appetite than average. So yeah, I do see a lot of opportunities there.
Oh, Michael, close enough. I too come from Middle Ohio region and also had a Mamaw and Papaw. Interestingly enough, I thought that was unique to us.
I hear that a lot.
Yeah. What I want to address, it's a question, but I think it might get addressed also in the panel and with the vision that you're trying to promote, which is in my community, which had lost lots and lots of jobs, Coshocton, Ohio is basically an empty shell. But what you really see that's the most problematic is a failure of hope. So my parents and grandparents, they didn't encourage us to reach for the stars. It was much more a question of if you raise your head too high, you might get it snicked off.
Yep.
And so my grandmother actually wanted me to become a diesel mechanic. She thought that was safe, and she was a little disappointed in the PhD. But but the question I want to ask is as you have plans to add jobs, to focus on innovation and to drive that, but a lot of these people are still going to feel like it's not for them. So how do you rebuild hope when I think that's the thing that seems to be most fleeting? I work in public engagement, and so a lot of my time is spent with urban high school students, trying to get them interested in health, in college, in all sorts of things. And I feel like the ones who are looking away, it's not because they're not interested, but they think it's not for them. And so I wonder, how are you going to build that into these programs?
Sure. Well, yeah, so we had a phrase in my family, and I know that a lot of others have had the same phrase, which is you don't want to get too big for your britches. I'm curious if you've ever heard that. But there's definitely a sense among some communities, I should say among some people, that if my kid or my grandkid goes off and gets an education, has a better job, that's not necessarily a good thing. And, you know, when I was 22, 23, I think that attitude, luckily my grandparents didn't have it, but I saw it enough from people in my family, that attitude really bothered me. And the more that I thought about it, okay, so why do folks that have that attitude? Why is it that a woman who grows up and doesn't have a lot of opportunity sees in her kid getting those opportunities that maybe the problem is that the kid has gotten too big for their britches or too big for their raisin or whatever phrase you want to use? And I think at least part of it is because there has been this remarkable stratification in the new economy and the old economy. And right, so you mentioned the concept of hopelessness, which I really agree with, but it's really easy to be hopeless when not just you and your family are struggling, but every single person in your neighborhood is struggling, and every single person in your community, as far as the eye can see, is struggling too. And so I think part of rebuilding that hope and maybe building the bridge a little bit from communities who see that they're completely cut off from the new economy is to actually bring some of that advantage to them and let people see that it's not all about my kid's going to go off to college and come back and be a little bit condescending about the culture that he came from, but my kid's going to go off to college and have access to a job where I can still drive and see my grandkids whenever they come along and maybe be a little bit more attached both geographically but also culturally to the kid that I raised. Because I think, you know, in talking to people, I think that sense, and bracket that for a second, because a professor of mine at Ohio State made this really astute comment to me. He said he worries that colleges serve a sociological function where they suck talent away from communities. They sort of re-engineer them a little bit. They make them, if anything, maybe a little condescending about where they came from. And then they almost ensure that those people are not going to go back, not just geographically, but they're never going to return culturally. And I worry a little bit about that. And I think that is in large part a consequence of the fact that we do have this remarkable stratification where good jobs have effectively completely abandoned whole towns and whole cities and even whole regions of the country. And so if you can start to correct that problem a little bit, maybe you start to correct that hopeless problem a little bit, and then also maybe you start to correct that cultural disengagement problem along with it. That's my hope. But look, you're never going to be able to reach everybody. There are always going to be families who struggle in one form or another, but I do think that we can make the problem a whole lot better than it is right now.
JD, just wondering if you could say a little more about the parallels that you see between the issues facing poor people in rural areas versus densely populated urban areas or the two coasts, and then this sort of a different type of stratification that seems to have emerged where almost everybody exclusively in densely urban areas has one viewpoint of what they consider to be their reality versus an urban one or a rural one or non-urban one. And how do you could you comment on that, and also just say, how do you think we can make some progress so that these two sort of different types of polar voices that we're hearing in the nation come together?
Sure. Well, so one of the most gratifying and in some ways surprising reactions to the book that I got was just the sheer volume of people who grew up poor, Black, and in the inner city who effectively have come up to me and said, this is my story too. This is the things that you write about are the very same things that I see. And so I do see a lot of similarities between the background that I have and the background that a lot of folks have. Not most people, of course, but there are a lot of real similarities. And I think there was that hilarious SNL skit, Black Jeopardy, that in some ways I think struck such a cultural chord because it revealed that in a lot of ways people aren't as different as we presume that they are. Now, there are differences too, right? And I think it's important not to gloss over the differences just because there are a lot of similarities. One obvious difference is that in densely populated areas, it's a little bit easier to reform the education system, or at least it should be, because if you reform the education system in a positive way, kids can actually access those schools. Whereas in rural areas, you talk to people who are working in school reform and they say, why am I going to build a new school? Nobody's going to be able to get to it. I was actually, having a conversation like that a little bit earlier today, and I hear that a lot from education reformers. I mean, the second thing that's really different, and I think that those of us on I'm a conservative, and those of us on the right should be a lot more mindful of, is that in a lot of cases, and this goes back to this point about hopelessness, Black Americans find themselves in incredible enclaves of concentrated poverty. Not necessarily because they choose to live in ghettos or because their parents did, but very often because of housing policy from 50, 60 years ago has sort of left its mark. I think that's a really important part of this because, as disadvantaged as my life was in a lot of ways, I at least lived in a neighborhood that wasn't completely going downhill. Maybe most of my neighbors were struggling, but a couple of people were still doing pretty well, and having that that example and just seeing people who aren't totally hopeless about the future, who feel like they have some sort of connection to some of the institutions of work and education that are necessary to get out of that circumstance, that's really powerful. And that's something that a lot of folks in the inner cities don't have because of really bad housing policy. And frankly, really bad housing policy that some ways has continued today. And so I think that there are differences, but I do think that there are more similarities than differences. And in those similarities, we should recognize that these problems are shared by a lot of people, and we should resist the temptation to say, that's that group's problem, I don't have that problem. We should recognize that these things exist across a broader swath of the country. And your question about sort of division, this is going to sound trite, but it also, I think, is honest. The only way to really heal the division that exists in our country is to get people to actually be in the same spaces as each other and to have the conversation with each other. Thanks. I just don't think there's any way to shortcut through the fact that when you have the geographic and political isolation that we have in our country right now, it's just going to be really hard for groups who don't see eye to eye to all of a sudden understand and empathize with somebody from the other side of the aisle. And the only way that I know how to remedy that, and the only thing that I've seen actually work, is to put people in a group to realize the caricature very often isn't true, and to recognize that these people who maybe I thought were a little bit different, they actually are very similar, and they're maybe not as crazy as I think they are when I only read about them from an article that a friend shared on Facebook. Oh, okay, sorry. I guess that's the last question, so thank you guys very much.
Yeah. Were they easy?
Thank you. They were mostly easy.
Thank you very much, JD. I do want to point out, too, that JD's book obviously is on sale outside, and you're invited to buy it there. And we think, I'm not going to actually make a promise about whether you'll be around to sign them, but I know he wants to. I know that much. At any rate, I'm sorry that we can't get to every question, but we also want to make sure that we have time for Q&A after the next presentation in the panel that will follow that. The entrenched poverty that I do want to say, though, that pointing out that getting together in a room and talking across difference really is something that's fundamental to our beliefs and our values here at the City Club. So I appreciate you for ending on that note. The entrenched poverty that J.D. Vance spoke about is just one of the many forces shaping the future of our nation and the future of the place that we call the heartland of America. That place itself is changing as well. Once upon a time, we thought of the heartland as the agricultural and industrial strongholds of the Midwest and the Upper Plains. But when we think about the economic trends that are shaping our nation, the Midwest has a great deal in common with places like Florida, Arkansas, and Texas. The authors of the report we've gathered to learn about and discuss suggest that there is, in fact, a new American heartland, one that stretches from Florida and Texas to North Dakota and the Great Lakes. While energy development and certain industries are spurring the regional economies across those heartland states, those states also share the economic pressures that Mr. Vance touched on. We'll hear now about the challenges and the opportunities facing this new American heartland and what the economy of the future might hold for all of us. Michael Lind is a co-author on the report. He's also co-founder and senior fellow of New America. He's worked at a number of publications that you've no doubt heard of, including The New Yorker, Harper's, The New Republic, and The National Interest. He has a few books to his credit. His most recent is Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. Mr. Lind will speak. Then we'll have a panel to respond following his presentation, and then again we'll invite all of you into a traditional City Club question and answer. After that, of course, the bar and the snacks will be served. The bar will be open and snacks will be served. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Lind.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The only thing worse than being the warm-up act for J.D. Vance is being the cleanup act, a task made infinitely more difficult by the announcement that I am an obstacle between you and drinks. So I will try to be succinct. I would like to thank the City Club for hosting the launch of our report, The New American Heartland, Renewing the Middle Class by Revitalizing Middle America, published with the support of the Center for Opportunity Urbanism. And I would like to thank my own organization, New America, for its support during the authorship of this. Now, if I can get this to work. Let's see. There we go. So we're announcing the discovery of a new region in an old country, ours. Now, looking at this, you might think it's somewhat arbitrary, and we could have included some states and excluded others. But I think this was not a completely random exercise in conceptual remapping. It's based, as you will see, on the coincidence, the geographic correlation of a lot of different things. And so we'll just go through this quickly. This is a concentration of blue-collar workers in the United States. This is manufacturing concentration. Do you start to see a pattern there? This is where fruit is grown in North America. A real overlap with manufacturing. Here we have where the shale gas is. So you see that in this area, it's somewhat arbitrary, that we call the New American Heartland, infrastructure. So the very same area where the food and the manufacturing and much of the energy is, also is the very heart of the network of American infrastructure. Is it possible to go back? Let's see. Or go for it. Well, maybe not. But so our argument is that historically there was a left-right kind of axis in America, and this was not because of geography, it was because of politics. Going back to the Northwest Ordinance, you had two societies in what grew into the United States of America, a free society and the slave plantation society. And completely different civilizations grew up in these different patterns of land use. The North was the land of small farms and of shopkeepers, and the South, until fairly recently, was dominated by this kind of latifundist, this very oligarchical agricultural society. Well, what has happened, beginning with the New Deal in World War II, and accelerating in the last few generations, is the development of the South, much of it like Texas and Florida, becoming known as the Sun Belt, the industrialization of hitherto very backward agricultural regions at the expense, in many cases, as those of you in Cleveland know, of older manufacturing areas in what was used to be known as the Midwest, and the Great Lakes region in New England. But so you're seeing a kind of new pattern emerging. For example, if you look at the automobile industry, instead of having two rival automobile industries, one in this area and then another of transplants in Appalachia and the Ozarks, you're seeing corporations orchestrating the emergence of a single integrated continental region, which includes suppliers in the old so-called Rust Belt, in the new transplant belt, and also in Mexico, in parts of Mexico. So this is a truly integrated North American region. The axis is vertical. It's essentially the Mississippi River Valley, the drainage basin, is what contains the vast majority of the productive industry and agriculture and energy of the continental United States. The area between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico is the source of, it's one of the great regions of productive power on the planet, along with Western Europe and South China and parts of littoral Asia. So our purpose in writing this report is to challenge what has become a prevalent view that this area, one of the great productive assets of the earth, is a derelict wasteland from which people should escape to go create apps in San Francisco or to go into finance in Wall Street. Here my task as being the cleanup act of J.D. Vance is made easier by J.D. himself, because in his remarks he talked about how we're on the verge of a technological revolution in a number of industries like logistics and agriculture and so on, which are not normally thought of as tech industries. And that is indeed the case. The low-hanging fruit of the digital revolution, of the ICT, information communications technology revolution, has already been picked. Automated tellers and having your PC first and then the phone, and the great gains from productivity in this century are going to come from digitalizing. That's the name, or digitizing, some people say, from old laggard industries such as agriculture, manufacturing, trucking, logistics, retail. We're only on the verge of the transformation of these industries, but to give you an example of how important this is, 100 years ago, the breakthrough technology was electricity, the electric motor, the internal combustion engine. So if you had looked at the United States in 1900, you would have thought, oh, well, the electrical motor and the automobile revolution, it's complete, because all of the cities, big cities, mostly along the coasts, they have electricity, and their car is in New York and Boston and so on. And then there's this impoverished realm in between and in the rural areas on the Atlantic seaboard. The real revolution was only beginning. And it took the form of the conveyor belt, of trucking, which essentially wiped out the railroads nearly for freight. It radically transformed the automobile, the nature of everything from retail. You get shopping malls, you get new cities springing up at the crossroads of interstate highways. You get completely new business models like drive-ins and so on. In terms of agricultural productivity, you get this elimination of labor-intensive agriculture by the mechanization of agriculture with tractors. You get with university help and government help. Cotton, my grandparents picked cotton in Texas, terribly degrading, brutalizing sort of thing, was mechanized finally in the 1940s. There was enormous dislocation, and the consequences of this economic and social dislocation persist to this day. I don't want to minimize them, but whether we like it or not, this kind of transformation is just around the corner. In agriculture, some completely unprecedented version of agriculture is going to emerge from a combination of biotech, drones, data analytics, satellite imagery, and other technologies yet to be developed. In trucking and logistics, we're very close to complete automation. And that's true in automobiles as well. There are legal and liability issues, but the technical issues, are pretty close to being solved. In manufacturing, we're seeing robotics. The United States is lagging behind Germany and Denmark, which lead us, and also Japan in robots per capita. But we're catching up. America's advanced manufacturing is fairly advanced right now. And you're seeing also a blurring of distinctions between traditional industries. So when you have 3D printing, a form of advanced manufacturing of prosthetics using human cells, here you have medicine and manufacturing fusing in a way that only science fiction writers could have imagined a few decades ago. How is this relevant to the new American heartland? Some of this may be invented in San Francisco or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in maybe finance from New York, but it's going to take place here. It's going to take place. You're not going to have a whole lot of agriculture on the island of Manhattan. The factories are going to be located where you have skilled workers. And there will still be skilled workers because the workers at every stage of technological progress, you're combining human labor with machinery so that one person with a machine can do more than maybe 3 people without the machine did before. So, you will still have jobs. Sometimes they will be completely new jobs. For example, if you look at retail, where a lot of the traditional stores are being destroyed by online shopping through Amazon. You see Walmart going online in order to, pioneer a new business model. So they're laying off store clerks, but within the warehouses, which are populated largely now by robots, but you also have human workers, jobs are expanding at the fulfillment centers. So we're looking at a fascinating new world. This is going to be the epicenter of it in this broad area between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, and between the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. Now, most people, including most people in this region, are not going to have jobs in these industries. There may be more jobs than we expect, but most of the jobs are going to be in the non-traded domestic service sector, things that cannot be automated and cannot be exported. And we know what those jobs are pretty much. It's the ones that have been growing for a decade or two now. It's in healthcare with an aging population, but also with improving medicine and falling medical prices. And that's a good thing. That's not something we should lament as long as they're adequately paid. You would want to have the best healthcare that an advanced society can have. We see education is growing. Retail and some sophisticated forms of retail. For example, we see this in banking, and it's kind of an analogy. Initially, as ATMs replaced tellers, you may recall, I'm sure this took place here as well as in the rest of the country, banks kind of downsized in the storefront bank, and you weren't quite sure what to do. But at least some banks have a new business model where, since a lot of the old clerical work and teller work is automated, they have more people to give you personal hands-on help with loans and with investment advice and so on. But from the point of view of economic development, even if these technologically transformed physical sectors that use atoms, move atoms around instead of bits, so to speak, even if they only employ a minority of people in your region, you need to have them in your region because of what economists call the multiplier effect. That is the indirect creation of economic activity, ancillary is the term JD used, by a particular kind of economic production. So let's put some numbers on this. So in the retail sector, The multiplier is 64 cents. That means for every dollar of retail output, you get 64 cents additional dollars. Wholesale trade, 60 cents. The fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, it's even less, 58%. Professional and business sectors, which everyone thinks is the knowledge economy, it's the wave of the future. People in offices just thinking and writing. That's 66 cents of impact per dollar of output. The sector with the largest multiplier effect of any economic sector is manufacturing. And that's true in the 21st century as it was in the 19th and in the 18th. According to the government, a dollar's worth of manufactured goods sales generates $1.40 in output from other sectors of the economy. And some scholars believe it's even higher than that, maybe $1.90. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. So if you have a robot factory in Ohio, employs nobody except, some of you may be old enough to remember George Jetson, you know, the cartoon character, and he's the only employee of the robot factory. Just press one button, that was the job all day. Okay, so we have, I think it was called Spacely Sprockets, and it's one employee, George Jetson. Nevertheless, thanks to the miracle of the multiplier effect, because of the energy inputs, the shipping, the raw materials coming in, the skilled labor for the other factories that contribute inputs in the region, local retail, advertising, marketing, design, insurance, finance, which in spite of Thomas Friedman's claim that the world is flat, tend to be provided within nation states. That is, particularly as they develop. So there's been this fantasy that we could cede all of our manufacturing to China, but then we would specialize in the design, right? And they would pay us royalties, for the intellectual property. The thing is, if your country has state-of-the-art, world-class factories, and all of the good designers are in New York or San Francisco, they can train designers. They're not stupid people, right? Whereas if you've allowed your industrial base to disintegrate, and you have a bunch of designers, and then the Chinese are no longer buying your designs, well, you're in real trouble. It's kind of hard to recreate a manufacturing and infrastructure industrial system. So, the idea of the new American heartland is, well, you could describe it this way. If this region were a company, and I were Warren Buffett, famous for finding undervalued assets and so on, I would see the new American heartland as a company which has fallen on hard times, needs an infusion of resources, needs some retraining of the staff. Possibly it needs new management, although, we'll see. But that this has enormous potential to drive the future not only of the citizens of the region, but of the United States of America. Thank you very much. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mike. So we're going to bring the panelists up here to respond to Mike's presentation and respond to the report. And as they assemble, let me tell you who's here. Michael Hecht is President and CEO of Greater New Orleans Incorporated, the economic development agency for Southeast Louisiana. Michael's done a lot of work with small businesses in New Orleans and in New York City as part of the administration of Michael Bloomberg. Michael, raise your hand so everybody knows that you're you. Okay, great. India Pierce Lee is coming up on stage as well. She's Senior Vice President for Programs at the Cleveland Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation in 2006, she worked at Neighborhood Progress Incorporated and has been a champion of smart, inclusive economic development throughout our community. She also serves on the board of the Center for Population Dynamics at Cleveland State University and the Visiting Committee of Cleveland State University. Rick Platt is President and CEO of the Heath Newark Licking County Port Authority. He was a visiting fellow in public leadership at Miami University in 2015. His official bio notes that he detests the term Rust Belt. Aaron Wren is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and a contributing editor at its quarterly magazine, City Journal. He is also an economic development columnist for Governing Magazine and a contributor to many other publications. Pete Saunders researches and writes about cities, specifically about economic and social trends and their impact on how we live. He does this mostly for Forbes, along with The Guardian, the Chicago Tribune, the Detroit Free Press, HuffPo, among others, including his own blog, Corner Side Yard. He's also an urban planner with degrees from Indiana University and the University of Illinois at Chicago. And Mark Schill is another contributor on the report. He's vice president of research at the Praxis Strategy Group in Grand Forks, North Dakota, also a part of the New American Heartland. Yes? Mark's economic population analysis work has appeared in Politico, Forbes, Money Magazine, the LA Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and he's managing editor and co-founder of the population and economic analysis site, newgeography.com. And our moderator is Joel Kotkin. Joel is the executive director for the Center for Opportunity Urbanism in Houston, Texas. That's where you can find a copy of the report, by the way. He serves as the R.C. Hobbs Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University and director of Chapman Center for Demographics and Policy. He's also executive editor of newgeography.com and a regular contributor to Forbes, Real Clear Politics, Daily Beast, and the Orange County Register. He's also the author of many books. His most recent is The Human City. Please welcome our entire panel, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off with a question, and we'll just see who bites. You heard Mike's description and about the possibilities. What's the biggest obstacle for the Heartland coming back?
I think it's the term Rust Belt. I'm hoping that when we rang that gong at the City Club that we signaled the end of that term and the end of the flyover city term. It is time that we bury it, and this is the New American Heartland. I think we started it here today.
Well, I hope that's correct. India, you're here in Cleveland. You're the one Clevelander on the panel. Do you see signs of this revival in Cleveland?
Well, I think the work that the Center for Population Dynamics has done has really changed the narrative about how we look at Cleveland and really looking at the macro level opportunities we have. And we like the Rust Belt. We're getting over ourselves, and I think we're moving in a new direction. And we have a lot of challenges, but we have a lot of opportunities, and I think that's the advantage.
I was going to ask you, Pete. You live in Chicago, but you're from Detroit. Now, Detroit would be considered the epicenter of the decline of the Heartland. Do you see that turning around?
I do see it turning around. I see green sprouts in Chicago, in Detroit. It is turning around, and I think it's happening because people are recognizing the opportunity that's even in a place like Detroit, given the fact that it's gone through a good half century of decline there. I think that's going to be the case for places like Cleveland and other cities throughout the New American Heartland or the Rust Belt. I've learned on the flip side of this to kind of embrace the term myself, because I think it's become part of our identity, but that's another discussion. But I like the opportunity. I think that as we move forward, I think that we're going to see more young people, the millennials, who are feeling priced out, and businesses that are feeling priced out of opportunity on either coast, looking at the physical advantages and the physical environment that exists in places like Cleveland, like Detroit, like Chicago, and I think that that's going to play a part in some of their revitalization.
Well, Aaron, by the way, you did not mention that Aaron is from Indiana, so he's not a New York slicker, that's me. So, Aaron, you study demographics. Is what Pete's talking about, is it beginning to become evident, or?
Well, the most important thing I would say is that if you look at that map, a heck of a lot of that new Heartland region is already prospering. You look at Nashville, Tennessee, you look at Houston, you look at Des Moines, you look at Fargo. Really that band through the Central Plains and a lot of the Sun Belt cities are doing well. And that gives me a lot of optimism, because it's easy to say, well, Cleveland could never be Manhattan. It won't be San Francisco. But I look at some of these Sun Belt cities, and the reality is they don't have many of the assets that many of these northern, upper Midwestern cities have. So I think to the extent that we can work through some of the legacy problems and frankly creating a new narrative, that will go a long way. I look, being from Indiana, I like, what's the difference between Indianapolis and Nashville, Tennessee, that makes Nashville's performance at a higher level? really there's nothing intrinsic to it. I think these cities have tremendous potential.
If I could
Sure.
interject real quick, you started by asking about what's the biggest challenge. And I think a lot of it is the mindset of the residents. It's it relates to the culture. It relates to us looking down at ourselves, upon ourselves, and not grabbing things by the handles and saying that let's lift this up and make this a better community or a better region or better states for all of us.
So that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to violently agree with that, because if you look at what happened to New Orleans pre and post Katrina, pre-Katrina New Orleans was in decline going back to the 60s when the Saints were founded. And post Katrina, it's a fact, and we kind of tie it with the Saints. Since Katrina, we've been one of the fastest growing economies in the country. Number one in technology growth, number one for foreign direct investment, number one for young people moving in. And some of that kind of goes to, Michael, what you said, is that we were kind of like a really crappy company, and Katrina was like a private equity takeover. They gave us new management and $140 billion of investment, and even we couldn't screw up $140 billion. But for all that better management and better money, you're right, Pete, it was the psychosocial impact of us looking and saying we can do better, we're going to do better, and then the Saints beating Atlanta in that first game back when we built the Superdome, saying, man, we really can do it. And without that emotional kind of phenomenon, which is not something you talk about typically in economic development, I wouldn't be sitting here today talking about how smart we are.
Yeah, and Mark, we've done a lot of work together in North Dakota. When I first went to North Dakota, I have to say those towns were pretty bleak. I used to joke with my friends that I'd always bring my own coffee from Los Angeles because
That's snobby.
but the coffee was terrible. Now there's lots of good coffee in North Dakota, and they need it. It gets cold there. But Mark, what was this attitudinal change in your community, both Grand Forks and I think even more so Fargo?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's happened yet all the way. I think it was interesting to hear Rick bring up the term Rust Belt, and then 4 panelists later we bring up the term narrative, but that's really what it is. And I think the narrative in the Central Plains has been about 80 years of stagnancy and decline. And now you're seeing, even from Oklahoma City to Omaha to Sioux Falls to Fargo and up the plains, that these cities are starting to compete and do pretty well. A city like Sioux Falls honestly has really no competitive advantage if you look at what it is, what the industries are there. They've really done it by working together, by communicating, and as a region, right? And a place like Fargo, I think what has changed there, certainly North Dakota went, I think it's 70 straight years with population decline until, of course, the shale boom happened in the last 5 years. But Fargo is really a different narrative where it was tech entrepreneurship. The economy had to change, and one firm in particular had to grow up to 1,200 employees, be acquired by Microsoft, throw out some equity investment, and change. JD mentioned capital, right? What we found is you can't recruit capital. You have to try to change the minds one at a time of the people with money in your region to invest it into these new industries, and that is very challenging. And you need these concrete examples to do that. Is show them. You can't tell them.
Is that happening here in Cleveland?
Yeah, I think with the knowledge economy and what we see in our healthcare systems, the biotech, we have an opportunity in attracting more capital to continue. And as you mentioned, the startups, we need to really invest in startups and take that kind of risk that we will attract the kind of companies and keep them here. I think that's the goal, keeping them here. But at the same time, I want to also segue back that as we bring these high tech and jobs in, we also can't forget those that won't be able, with the education, to get those high tech jobs. And so what do we do for the people that we heard a lot about J.D. Vance talking about? How do we use these economies to help everyone and create the kind of equity we need to really have the kind of city that we has an economic opportunity for everyone?
Well, I'd like to maybe turn that over to Mike, because we've worked together in New Orleans quite a bit. New Orleans, obviously, great things are happening, but you have this legacy poverty issue. How do you address that while you're trying to do the things India's talking about?
Well, so it's a short-term, long-term gain, and the long-term stuff is, of course, most fundamentally important. We were talking at lunch about the schools in New Orleans, and if you had gone to pre-Katrina to one of the 80% of the public schools that were bad, then statistically you had a 1% chance of going to a 4-year college when you entered kindergarten. Okay, that's how predetermined it was. So since then, the charter schools now are arguably some of the more successful or most successful in the country. We've gone from like 65% failing down to about 5%, but that's long-term generational stuff that's going to make a difference. But in the immediate term, it's about being intentional. We, beyond just being one of the fastest-growing entrepreneurial communities in the country, we talk about inclusive innovation. We have a program, there's one called Operation Spark, which goes into schools and it teaches tech and entrepreneurship specifically to kids so that local kids who have been here for generations can get into the tech community, and it's not just a bunch of hipsters with ironic facial hair on Vespas getting all the jobs, right? You know, too bad Richard Florida. So, so it's about intentionality and about trying to encourage the influx and the brain gain at the same time, not forgetting you know, your home base, and you got to do both at the same time.
Well, you know, one of the more extreme cases, and Pete's written some great stuff about this, is in Chicago, where you've had along the lakeshore tremendous gentrification and quite a few companies relocating, and yet much of the city, I always torture him with this, one of the great lines that Pete has, which was Chicago is one-third San Francisco and 2/3 Detroit. What do we do in a city like Chicago? What policies might turn that around?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that there's not just an economic hurdle, there's a social hurdle that's in a city like Chicago. A long, centuries-long history, legacy of segregation in Chicago, in many of our upper Midwest cities. And that's been the ultimate challenge. What's happened in Chicago as we've seen the North Lakefront prosper and housing prices rise, and in that area, you know, there are calls for more affordable housing to be constructed in other within those areas where people want to live. Well, one could argue that there's plenty of affordable housing in the south and west side of Chicago, and that maybe one of the things that a city like Chicago, and this might sound like heresy to people who live on either coast, but maybe Chicago is the kind of city that could benefit from more gentrification as it expands into other communities. The fact is that when you look at low-income census tracts in metropolitan areas from 1970 to 2015-16, there are more of them now, and there are fewer affluent census tracts in our metropolitan areas because wealth has clustered in certain areas, and poverty has expanded throughout much of our metropolitan areas. So I think we have to be, to go to Mike's phrase, intentional about how we move forward in bringing that kind of income and affluence and equity back to those communities as well.
We've talked quite a bit about the urban situation, but you know, JD really is also writing about more rural, small-town communities. Now, Rick, you know, you're in those kind of communities. What kind of policies would prevent the spread of the kind of decay that we've seen in a lot of these smaller towns?
Well, I think where I grew up 50 miles south of here. I mean, when you Google the term Rust Belt, Ohio, my hometown shows up number one on the images list. It hits close to home, but I'm now in central Ohio, and we've seen a resurgence. We've been bullish on manufacturing. We've in an industrial park that our Port Authority owns, it's former Air Force Base. Boeing is there working on small component electronics. You don't do that with robots. It's very small components. Right down the street, we've had 6 spec buildings built in 6 years. The energy industry has found its way there, making compressed natural gas tanks and equipment for compressors with high precision necessary. Just down the road from us, L Brands has invested with Bath and Body Works in putting a manufacturing village together so that instead of seeing their products on a boat coming from overseas and their customers' ideas about that product changed, they can make it in Central Ohio and ship it around the United States and the world. And then Amazon, with 4,000 jobs just before Christmas, opened up a facility in our county as well. So, you know, I think we're our microcosm of the new American Heartland, and I believe that Northeast Ohio will see that too.
Aaron, you're from Southern Indiana, and we've talked about your hometown and where you grew up. What is the biggest barrier? I mean, obviously, Rick's area has made some progress, but things don't maybe look quite as good in Southern Indiana.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of rural communities are actually within commuting distance of major metropolitan areas. And where I grew up is in the Louisville metro area. You know, it's a 45-minute drive to downtown Louisville. You know, Louisville has a massive logistics and manufacturing cluster. It's UPS's global air hub. So UPS employs 20,000 people in Louisville. And there's tremendous amount of warehouses and spin-off manufacturing there. So there are jobs. In fact, my dad ran a gravel quarry that was very good jobs. A lot of the challenges are the social problems. Frankly, they're finding qualified labor, and by qualified meaning someone who will show up to work every day with a high school diploma, can pass a drug test, has a driver's license. Very, very basic things is actually very hard in a lot of those places because of the social instability. So their problems are, in a sense, greater than the economy. There is a challenge with jobs in many places, particularly with this Great Recession. There's a community called Elkhart, Indiana, that is in the RV manufacturing business. It's the king, and so it's a very pro-cyclical. People don't buy RVs when times are getting bad. I looked at their job swings in the last 3 economic cycles. It's becoming more pro-cyclical. The swings of employment are becoming wilder. And so these communities, some of these communities at least that I've looked at have gotten more whipsawed with the economic cycle. So I think those are the 2 challenges I would see: very cyclical employment and then the social challenges.
Mark, you work in a lot of small communities, Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and of course in the Dakotas. What do you see as the big challenges to these more rural areas?
I think if you look at it, you find that the smaller, and how you define rural is even a separate question, but it's those communities and regions that are isolated that are doing more poorly than those that have forged connections. So it's things like, I live in a metropolitan area of 100,000, but as recently as 20 years ago, we couldn't get the same day's Wall Street Journal and New York Times, right? That's changed. So when you think about things like proximity to half-decent air connections, to broadband, which in some rural states actually are doing a good job at that, those types of connections. But then I think capitalizing or doing the best you can to recognize that the economy is based on networks. And so what you can do to forge and maintain those connections, if you have people that have left your community, great. They're now an asset with ties back to a smaller region, right? And so I think the bigger question that got me thinking was when JD was talking about reforming schools in a small town and saying that, it's not, the smaller you are, it's not necessarily a matter of creating different alternatives and sending the kids there, right? Reforming a school becomes not a policy question, but a personal question of sitting down with the people running those schools and saying, and trying to change their minds and reform that. And so that has a positive and negative, right? A smaller community, you can get the people into one room that you need to make some of those changes, or decide who needs to go, right? So that's a positive. Or as a return migrant, you can come and get engaged at a high level in your community in a hurry, right? And apply your skills and make a difference. So there's 2 sides to that, I think. But it's connections is critical, both tangible and intangible.
Now, the last question will make everyone uncomfortable, which is my job, I suppose. If you look at the map that Mike showed, that is almost exactly the map that elected Donald Trump. Is there going to be a possible negative impact on this region, whether it's on energy or manufacturing or in the logistics industry, if the current administration dissolves as quickly as it appears?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Joel, we started a discussion about manufacturing the Midwest and the middle class before the presidential election, before Donald Trump entered it. I don't think the federal government and what policies are making, the trend towards the new American Heartland started before all that discussion. It will continue.
I agree. My concerns with the current administration are much more international than domestic. I think the domestic is still very much not just within our control nationally, but I think that we're seeing the ascendancy of states and the ascendancy of cities more than that And so it's all within our own control. It's about the business community standing up, and it's about building the right brand.
I think there's a distinction that you could make. I think that many of the larger cities in the new American heartland are probably rather insulated from what is going to happen or what could happen, potentially happen at the federal level. And they've made many of the necessary restructurings and moves to be able to secure their own future. The challenge is going to be for those mid-sized and smaller communities that are in the maybe 200,000 to 100,000 person metro area that did largely vote for President Trump and did invest everything into his election. If there's any change there, I think that you may see some rumblings there, but it also speaks to the broader issue, the broader problem of what to do with those mid-sized heartland metros.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I think there's two sides to that. I think if you talk to folks in the energy industry, they welcome Trump, right? Unwinding the Clean Power Plan, for instance. But I think there's some threats with Trump as well, as discussions of dismantling some of the trade agreements have many in the ag community, for instance, saying, wait a minute, many of our clients are overseas, particularly Asia, and we're talking about the productive economy here. International trade matters. And Mike mentioned what's become a network of suppliers in the automobile industry, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Breaking that down, disintegrating that quickly could have major negative implications, right? And so I think with any administration, there's pros and cons, and it's a matter of looking at both sides of it.
So I think at the end, what we're agreed is the future of the heartland lays with the heartland, and it really lays in whether or not this area wants to move forward and has the will to move forward. I think that's going to be the key thing in the future. And I, as somebody who lives on one of the coasts myself, I think that one of the important things that we try to do with the report, and what Mike and I have talked about, is to convince the rest of the country that what happens in Cleveland doesn't just matter to Cleveland. It matters to the rest of the U.S. The great gift America has is that we are the one country with an extremely high-end economy and a powerful heartland with lots of natural resources and food and industrial capacity. We're the only country in the world with both, and I'm hoping that people will see this as an opportunity for the American future and not sort of a rear guard action to try to bail out something that has very little hope. So I'm thrilled that you're all here, and I would hope that maybe we could take some questions now. That would be terrific.
So this is going to take me longer to walk here than it will for you to walk to the microphone to ask a question. But we're going to do the Q&A as we did before. The microphones are right there. And it's a good thing you're right there, sir, so you can start, because I was going to kick it off. But now I don't have to. Yay.
So JD had mentioned the opiate crisis. And I was looking at a map and trying to see if that also correlated to the kind of heartland geography. And it doesn't really, although there's a broad swath through the heartland that is really suffering. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of correlation here? How much of an impediment is the growth in the opiate addiction problem?
It's huge. And definitely, if you look at the CDC maps of risk for HIV and hepatitis C in those from drugs, it heavily overlaps with the kind of Appalachian belt that J.D. Vance wrote so impressively about. But it's a problem in lots of places, and significant numbers of people are addicted to drugs. It is not just the opioids. In the county I grew up in, we led the state in meth labs bust per capita. And it's just, it's the prescription opioids, it's meth, it's heroin, it's fentanyl, it's all of them. And so it's a terrible challenge, and it really wrecks families and lives generationally. I would say in a lot of these communities, there's nobody there that hasn't had a family member personally affected in one way or another. And certainly it's a gigantic, forget it being an impediment to the economy, it's a disaster for the people.
Rick, do you see that in your area?
We do, and it is a problem in our state. I mean, it's children are the victims of it. I mean, we really In our community, the county's having to find in its budget the money to pay for children's services to be able to have these children who are the victims of this opioid situation to be put into foster homes. And we need to encourage adoption as an alternative so that we are adopting fellow Ohioans. And to me, long term, it's a workforce issue. If we're going to realize the benefits of the opportunity of New American Heartland, we do need to make sure that we have a workforce. We've lost a population in Ohio. We can't afford to lose any more just by neglect.
I think no matter what the maps say, a lot of these drugs, particularly things like synthetic fentanyl, are being obtained online and are starting to cross-cut socioeconomics. So the way to look at it is if it's not a problem in your community, it will be soon. And the other thing I would say is it's a twofold issue. One is aligning the resources and treatment agencies and all these institutions that are already there to provide treatment and recovery and all those things. But then it's also elevating that conversation and making it okay to discuss publicly to help increase the size of the funnel to try to get people to the treatment that does exist. And those are two different things.
Michael, it's a problem in New Orleans, I assume.
Well, it's a problem in New Orleans on two fronts. One is with the kids, and we're seeing it. It's also a problem in that heroin is the cause of a lot of the gang issues that are leading to the high homicide rate. And ironically, what's happening now is that as we're getting better at constraining the supply of heroin coming over from Mexico generally, now the gangs are turning on each other and fighting for inventory. So there's all these kind of knock-on things, and it's just when you think you got the problem under control, it spreads to something else.
You know, I did just want to note the irony of the concern over the opioid epidemic and its economic impact, but not the same concern back in the 80s and 90s for heroin and crack and the economic impact that it had on many communities throughout the country. I think it's great that we're looking at the opioid epidemic as something that has a broader public health problem. But we cannot look at what happened 20, 30 years ago as an example for how to address this.
I think we need to learn from that. I mean,
Right.
it's hard as a white male to understand that. I've had friends of mine who are Afro-American talk about it. That's a mistake that we made, and we need to learn from it.
Indeed.
But I think, we keep talking about the rehab and the fact we need to deal with the policies and the real issues that are at the root cause. And it goes back to prescription drugs and how doctors are doing that, and the years and years of that, as well as all the other, things we're talking about. But until we deal with the root causes, not only with this, but also the other social things we've talked about today around poverty, we're not going to, really cure what we're trying to do. We'll just keep feeding the same systems over and over again and funneling people through the same way. So we really need to buckle down. It's like you said, being intentional, getting everybody in the same room, regardless of what side you're on, and dealing with the root cause and doing something about it and not talking about it.
That's great. Ma'am, you've been standing for a while.
Well, I'm visiting from California, and this has been a marvelous afternoon. I recently spent 8 years living in Mountain View and going to church in Palo Alto, so it's sort of ground zero for technology and venture capital. And I had been going to ask Mr. Vance earlier about approaching venture capitalists, because there are a lot of them who really care about America and who really, would like to put their money where their mouth is. After seeing the second presentation and the map with the shale oil distribution, and I don't know that you would ever get a California venture capitalist to be interested in investing in anything that does not involve renewable energy. And so I'd like to know where y'all stand on that.
I'll address the first part of the question. So we've been trying to deal with in Southeast Louisiana about the fact that 75% of VC is in the Bay Area or in Massachusetts. And I can tell you, as somebody that lived in Mountain View and lived in Palo Alto, and with the school with all those guys on Sand Hill Road, and they're all guys, that when you talk to venture capitalists, JD not included, they are very happy where they are. In Menlo Park, in Greenwich, Connecticut, in Manhattan, and trying to get them to even open up offices in other places around the country, it's very difficult because there is a herd-like mentality and a certain kind of laziness, I think, actually, in that community, a risk averseness, let's call it that, which presents a challenge in getting it to flow other places. Just my opinion.
I would take somewhat of a, I mean, I don't think Silicon Valley venture capital is the end-all, be-all. In Indianapolis, 4 guys started a company called ExactTarget, built it up to well over 1,000 employees, internet marketing company. Salesforce.com bought them for $2.5 billion. And actually now Salesforce is staffed up there, hundreds more workers, and Salesforce logo is now at the top of the tallest building in the state of Indiana, which used to be a bank. And so there are definitely companies. I think a lot of the challenge is, frankly, it's you got to have great entrepreneurial ideas with the potential of gigantic returns. And a lot of times in the Midwest, I see a lot of lack of ambition in terms of that. You always hear it spun as a positive. We're the business model people and things like that. Well, that's great. If you want to be the business model people, that's not what they do. But if you look, you know, Chicago's had plenty of entrepreneurial companies coming out of there. So I think that there's opportunities for great ideas to be started in the Midwest. I don't believe a lack of Silicon Valley venture funds in the Midwest is the barrier to building the tech industry.
That's right. It's not that it's not. People who say that capital is a barrier, it ain't. It's annoying.
Ask about the second part of the question, and that has to do with the renewable energy.
Well, I think that's another important one, because a lot of times the people in the Midwest take their cue from the trends on the coasts. It's like we want to kind of echo their talking points, because it's like we're auditioning for a place in the play, and you know, we have to play to our own strengths, right? And to the extent that the strength is manufacturing, that it's some type of fracking technology, that it's some other type of thing that doesn't fit with what they do. Locals have to have the courage to pursue that business and pursue getting it funded locally. I wouldn't let them, their like green energies is, you know, I wouldn't let that be a veto over what you do in Cleveland.
Yeah, I'd say 2 things. I think a lot of it's driven by market. There's a lot of innovation and research and development happening in new energy technologies, and once those become competitive, particularly things like solar, battery technologies, coal has been threatened by natural gas-fired plants for electricity, right? So once those technologies become competitive, a lot of these existing energy industries will be threatened, and it's a matter of the innovation in, I think, particularly storage. And you might see some decentralization of power generation happen, but it will be, because that will become the area of least friction of these new technologies.
And to be clear, talking about all the oil and gas companies in Louisiana, these companies are energy companies. The fact that it might be oil or gas or nuclear, that's kind of incidental to the strategy of maximizing shareholder returns in energy in the broadest way. So if it's bagass tomorrow, I just wanted to say bagass on camera, that's a real word, people, then they'll go in that direction. It's a very kind of amoral, kind of proposition. They're just going to do what's going to make the most money.
Just, I can't resist it. I shouldn't, but I won't.
It was bagass, wasn't it?
No. I've studied California since 1982, written about it since 75. I wouldn't necessarily hold it out as a great example of where the rest of the country wants to go. People will not pay the premium to live here that they'll pay in California. Just, whatever, God gave us a pretty good hand. Second, is the kind of policies that we're pursuing in California are creating really huge class divides. Jamie Galbraith at the University of Texas has done the studies, and California is a state where the inequality is, not only is it higher, but it's growing. Just to give you a little illustration, given the policies that we've adopted in California, we now have the highest rate of poverty in the United States, highest percentage. When you figure in the cost of living, it's the highest. So I'm not sure it's a great role model. There's enormous wealth in certain places in the coast, but I can tell you there are many places in the interior that have many of the same problems that JD wrote about. 10 million people living in the interior of California who in many ways are suffering in very much the same way as people in Appalachia.
You've actually kind of addressed this. Hi, I know it's me again. You've kind of addressed this question a little bit already, but I want to go back to this question of how do we make progress that isn't race blind and class blind, because I feel that, thank you, because I worry a little bit about, I work in a museum. I study history. I do history of technology and history of medicine, and I'm very uniquely aware of the disparities. Right here in Cleveland, we have one of the highest infant mortality rates, and the difference between African American infant mortality rates and white infant mortality rates are enormous. So as you were talking about the gap, that as the gap is growing, historically, as I look at the sweep of history, it doesn't seem like we've made progress in this area. And so as we're looking to the future to rebuild the new American heartland, how do we do that in a way that isn't blind to the racial and class and economic disparities that we already have, and not paper them over as we seek to address them? So I just wondered if we could.
Yeah, let me start. You know, I think first of all, I think we need to come to grips with our history, with our racism legacy throughout particularly as I look at the upper Midwest, the Clevelands, the Detroits, the Chicagos, the Indianapolis, the St. Louis cities that have had long-standing issues. And one thing that I do think, you know, people may argue or people know about how southern cities after the period of slavery invented the Jim Crow area. I think a real case could be made that cities of the upper Midwest created a new non-race racism, which separated people via redlining and housing policy and education policy. I think we need to start to fix that by recognizing that legacy, recognizing what role these communities, these metros played in developing that, and how to examine that, evaluate it, break it down, and build something that's better. I do also run into a lot of people who are very interested in doing this, but their knowledge seems to be rather limited to their understanding of these kinds of issues over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, and we're talking about something that's far deeper and far longer than that. So I think that's the first step.
Well, just to that point, and you can look this up, through an organization here, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, we're doing a year of awareness building through the Racial Equity Institute. And it deals just what you're talking about, looking at the history, the historical, institutional, and structural racism, and the policies that, you know, existed then and still exist now that have kept our neighborhoods and community apart. And so working with corporate, nonprofit, public sector, trying to get as many leaders as we can to actually go through and learn this and then have those conversations and not being afraid. You know, we're past that now. I think we're at the point now where we have to have the honest conversations, and all of us, we have our own biases, and we have, whether it's, you know, implicit or explicit, but having that conversation and understanding how the policies and programs that we all do as gatekeepers to people rather than for people. And I think this is the time, you know, to this year and beyond for us in Cleveland, and I think we're already headed down the right path, but we got a lot of work to do.
Can I give one practical solution on that one? At the real practical level, I don't know, you sat down again, but, oh, there you go. But you're at work for a museum, right? It's just about cultivating diversity at the governance level. It's a really practical thing you can do. So our organization is 115 years old or so. We were founded in 1902. I'm either horrified or proud to say that this year we have our first chairperson of color in the 115-year history of this organization, which is obscene. But I'm glad that it finally got done, and it didn't happen by accident.
Maybe next question, just.
I would be interested in your experience in New Orleans or others from the panel. As you brought in new, higher skilled jobs, it certainly made sense to make intentional changes to the education system. But what did you do about the workforce you already had, the lower skilled job workforce that you had in your community? Because we find that oftentimes adults reading, math, and literacy skills prevent them from accessing even very good vocational technical training programs. So how did you go about connecting and engaging the existing workforce in New Orleans or other experiences from the panel?
really quickly, I mean, look, so the biggest industry in New Orleans by numbers is hospitality. Hospitality is generally, low skill. So there was broad employment, but not a lot of wealth creation. And so the issue, of course, is diversifying the economy so there's more opportunities to create wealth, individual wealth over time. In terms of taking existing population and creating wealth in existing older adults, and that's hard. And I don't think we have the answer to that yet. I mean, we talk about it a lot, and because when you talk about equity, which is the word that's being used a lot, it's never defined, and it means two very different things. To some people, it means equality of opportunity. To some people, it means equality of outcome. I can tell you personally that enforcing equality of outcome is very hard to do. Enforcing equality of opportunity takes a generation or more to manifest. And so post-Katrina, we don't have the answer for that yet.
Rick, I know you have some experience. I think at one point you were trying to bring people from Cleveland, or there were people from inner cities to have opportunities in Licking County?
Well, I mean, we've seen pre-employment training as a mechanism that, I guess, one of the things when you can get it down to a size that's manageable, the resources can be mustered together. We can bring our employers together and say, here's the type of skills we're looking for. If there are 10 steps to get from someone who's working in an underemployed situation to being ready to work on a manufacturing floor, maybe the first 4 can be done with a curriculum developed by manufacturers, presented by manufacturers, who then are able to, in the room, be with the people who are getting the training and say, okay, we're getting through to folks, here's the folks that we think can actually come in to work on our plant floor. We've seen that work in Licking County in the past, and in a tight labor market, which we're all starting to see in manufacturing, we're going to have to do more and more of that.
Yes, please.
I have a question about the last topic, about the Trump administration. I think that one of the big assets of the Midwest is education. And, we had manufacturing, but I think education is also a big one. Do you guys aren't worried with the Trump administration ideas of cutting education, if that's going to have an effect in the Midwest? Because they're trying to become ourselves a knowledge economy and bringing people in from different countries. What's your opinion on that?
Anybody want to tackle that? And on education policy, since most education funding is local, but
I think you said it, Joel, that New American Heartland, we've got to seize what is ours to seize, and education is it.
For federal.
And well, go ahead, because I know you have a lot going on with healthcare in New Orleans.
Well, hey. I mean, so we just expanded Medicaid in Louisiana. It's been a good thing for us. NIH funding is critical. I understood that NIH funding was put back into the last budget, wasn't it? That's in the omnibus, so I think we're okay for the moment. But anyway, look, bottom line is that if you stop investing in research and investing in the future at our universities, we obviously lose one of our key competitive advantages. So it'd be a disaster long term.
One thing I'd add is, totally echo that, is a threat to the federal funding for a lot of this basic research is where that's generated a lot of our innovation in a lot of different industries over time. But one area where Ohio is unique is, I think Ohio per capita is number 2 in state funding of high-level research through the Third Frontier program. And so Utah's number 1. And so that's a foundational thing where the state has said we're going to invest in ourselves, right? And do some of that.
Point here, I think it's all coming together now, is that if you look at, I forgot who said it before, it might have been JD, that technology is what spurs productivity. Maybe it was our lunchtime conversation. That technology that has spurred productivity has oftentimes, I think probably always maybe, been instigated by government spending, usually around war, right? Why is Silicon Valley Silicon Valley? It was because of the investment in the radio that the government made for military purposes in the Bay Area. And so, it has these knock-on effects that are unpredictable, but history proves out. And so if you don't invest in innovation, that probably at the top-down level, you're probably consigning your country or your nation over time to being marginalized.
Thank you very much for the great panel. So first, a little disclaimer. I'm Jessica Ice. I'm with Jumpstart Inc., which is an organization that supports entrepreneurs in Northeast Ohio with services and venture capital. And I definitely want to shout out to Mark Skrill for mentioning the Ohio Third Frontier because we are supported by the Ohio Third Frontier. So my question is actually, what do you see, what stage of company do you really see that there is the true venture gap? Because there are a lot of state support for entrepreneurship and certainly in our region and across the state. So I mean, is there a specific stage where you really see that there's a significant gap? Is it very early or sort of Series A, or what gap do you see? And I was told I could ask one extra question, so sorry about that. But I just want to know why you don't like the term Rust Belt. I mean, I think it's great. Like, Rust Belt chic, man. I was in New York, and I was talking to someone, I was like, yeah, I'm from Cleveland. And they're like, Rust Belt chic, so cool. Oh, my God. So why not?
Well, I guess I got to answer that one, Joel. You know, Richie has tried to convince me that I should believe that. My kids probably don't see Rust Belt the same way I do, so I confess that Richie's probably right about that. I still want to bury it. You know, I just think it's a derogatory term. It's a pejorative. We can move on to something else. We don't call Nevada, which is run into tough times, which is called the Silver State. Silver tarnishes. We don't call it the tarnished state. At any rate.
Whoa, you just blew my mind. Shut it down. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, one quick point about Rust Belt is that I spoke at an event in Chicago a couple of years ago, and the whole event was about urban authenticity. And everyone was talking about, you know, what is it that makes a city, a neighborhood, a community authentic? And immediately people gravitated to the whole issue, the notion, the image of the Rust Belt. To a lot of people, there are people who say the Rust Belt is authentic. Yes, we have rusting towers of industry. We have vacant buildings, but it's something that we've loved and lost and moved on, and that contributes to a sense of authenticity to a lot of people. That's part of why I embrace it right now, and it's probably going to be more difficult for someone who lived through the love and lost part and is focusing more on the upswing to be able to see that. But it does carry a lot of cachet with a lot of people.
Don't forget that one. That's important too.
On the first question, in New Orleans, we did an analysis and we discovered we've been great at starting companies and terrible at scaling them. So of the companies that we've started since 2000, mostly post-Katrina, 7% of them are now at $1 million or more, which I don't know what the national average is, but it feels low, right? But as we dig down into it, we don't think that capital, whether it's mezzanine or Series A, is the issue, except for entrepreneurs of color where friends and family money is not there, right? So that's a very special issue, very real issue. But generally you find the issue is that there's not, for all companies, not enough mentorship, not enough domain experience, not enough access to people to try beta versions of their products. All the other things that like a Y Combinator or a Techstar does so well in a Bay Area or a Denver. So we think it's the other things that make people better business people that's missing.
And you know, we're at the early stage of figuring this out ourselves, but I think the money's on the second stage companies. There's a company, Edward Lowe Foundation, the gentleman that invented kitty litter, put his money into that foundation and focused on economic gardening. How do we make sure that those second stage companies, you know, maybe they got good at something that got them started, they survived that startup phase. That's where the real growth is. How do we help them figure out exporting if that's what will help them advance, or figure out some technological component that wasn't in their wheelhouse? In our staff, we've got a person certified in economic gardening. It's really starting with us as an attempt to try to diversify some of our economic base in Lincoln County.
Economic gardening is taking your economic development resources and deploying them directly to firms with know-how and assistance, right? One thing to add to Michael's point, I think the bigger challenge is probably that nationally business starts are way down, right? And so back to the ecosystem things, the mentorship, the getting an engineer with a product, the skills, tools, connections they need to make things happen are just as important as that. The bigger issue is we're just not starting enough companies in general.
I don't want to keep you from your food and drink too much longer. One last question, please.
Hi. One of the biggest sound bites that came out of the last election cycle was, we don't care where jobs are in America as long as they don't leave the country. Let's keep them here, and wherever they move is where they move. One of the things that Michael had said, he used a phrase a little bit ago, cities and states emerging, and it kind of conjured this image of like Greek city-states and the competitions between them in some ways. Having grown up in a community, Wilmington, Ohio, that's been well chronicled, DHL came in on a 7-year tax abatement. Community of 25,000 people ended up losing 10,000 jobs when they left, when that tax abatement expired. Northern Kentucky had a more attractive offer than Southern Ohio did, and so they left. On a more local level, I live in a community now where we just poached Walmart from a community 2 blocks over, offered them tax incentives just to come over a few blocks and add several hundred jobs to our community, removing them from others. My question is this just the new normal in the way that things will work? Will we develop this city-state mentality and continue to fuel it with things like tax abatements? Or is there a pragmatic solution to really spread the wealth within the new heartland and try to create a level playing field where we're not constantly taking jobs and resources from each other in this zero-sum game? Thanks.
Wow. To me, I think you need to read Opportunity Urbanism. There was a sales pitch for it. I mean, it was George Voinovich. I worked for him for a few years in state government, who used to go around the state and say, a great Clevelander, that Ohio is a collection of city-states. He wasn't saying it as a negative thing. What he's saying is there are pockets of opportunity that if a community can figure out what they're good at and what they want, they can get there. And that was his message then. I think it's still true today. And that's what Opportunity Urbanism is.
I think that census. All right. I snuck up on you.
Okay.
So this evening at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum on the opportunities and challenges facing the new American Heartland. Before I get through the rest of the script, I know a lot of you want to go buy books. So we've got Michael Lynn's book, Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States. We have Joel's book, The Human City, Urbanism for the Rest of Us. If you prefer not to read his website, you can read the book. And then there's this other book by some guy named Vance, also for sale, Hillbilly Elegy, as you know. Tonight's forum was presented by Albert and Audrey Ratner with additional support from the Port of Cleveland. Thank you so much. We appreciate your continued support of City Club programming. We are also pleased to have presented our forum. It's like a 2-for forum, or a 3-for almost, that we got going on here, in partnership with the Center for Opportunity Urbanism and the Center for Population Dynamics at Cleveland State University's Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. Our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. We appreciate their partnership. Additionally, we welcome guests hosted by the Avon Lake United Church of Christ, FSM Capital Management, LLC, Global Cleveland, and Jumpstart. We thank all of you for being here today. And I did just mention the books. The book sales are made possible by our partners at A Cultural Exchange. That brings us to the end of our program. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our speakers today, all of you for participating. Thank you for your great questions. Please enjoy a drink and some snacks. The forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.